Hi everyone. I imagine most people by now will know of this guy. This is Leroy Jethro Gibbs from the TV show NCIS. It's been running about 17 years, I think. And this is played by Mark Harmon. Now, in the show, Gibbs is a Marine who has become the head of the top naval criminal investigative service, and he has a set of rules that he lives his life by, and one of which is Gibbs Rule number 39: there is no such thing as a coincidence. So Gibbs applies this rule into his investigations in the show whenever two cases which are seemingly unconnected have paths that cross. Now, I thought of Gibbs because of the Skripal story which I've been covering, which seems to have increasingly more to do with agents of a type that once worked for Her Majesty's MI6 than it does have anything to do with agents of a type developed by Russia. For instance, do you think, rather, it's a coincidence that Sergei Skripal not only knew, but was close to, friendly with, and lived in the same town as Christopher Steele? Now, Christopher Steele, let me remind you, is the former MI6 agent who was the author of the Dossier on Donald Trump. Do you think that's a coincidence, or do you think those two things and the poisoning are connected? I'll leave that up to you to decide. But the P dossier was originally funded by a US Republican Party affiliated media outlet called the Washington Free Beacon. And Steele's company, Orbis Business Intelligence, coincidentally employed another former MI6 agent called Pablo Miller as a consultant. Now, we know Miller worked at Orbis because this was listed through his LinkedIn profile. And it was confirmed that he was working as a consultant at the firm, and that LinkedIn profile has now been deleted. So, well, maybe that's just a coincidence too. For instance, maybe you could explain that by saying hackers manipulated search results to make it look as if the LinkedIn profile was there and was deleted, as Luke Harding did. Luke Harding, you might remember, is the author of Collusion, a book on alleged collusion between Trump and Russia, which was totally devoid of any evidence of collusion at all. So Pablo Miller, getting back to him, also just happened to be the former recruiter and handler of Steele's friend, former Russian colonel and British spy, Sergei Skripal. So it turns out the three of them knew each other, may well have worked with each other, and certainly may well have all known each other back to the mid-2000s, maybe. So maybe that's another coincidence. Nobody knows, or at least I can see proof of, whether Sergei Skripal was part of any operation to dig the dirt up on Trump, but it would make sense, as Steele was basically using the funding he was getting from the Washington Free Beacon to bribe various officials within or associated to the Kremlin for any potential dirt they had on the Republican nominee, Donald Trump. And Skripal would maybe even be a source himself, or would possibly know of many other potential contacts. So Steele and Miller start work on the now infamous Golden Shower dossier. However, Trump then wins the nomination from the Republican Party, which surprised everyone at the time, and the Washington Free Beacon no longer requires to use Steele's company, because they don't want to obviously dig up dirt on who is their now nominee for president. Now, all was not lost for Steele and company, though, as Hillary Clinton now continued the funding through Fusion GPS, and Steele continued to try and dig up any further dirt on Trump. So he continued the work. The people who were paying him just changed from a conservative media outlet to Hillary Clinton's PAC. So Hillary Clinton, by the way, I've mentioned her in another coincidence, was revealed by WikiLeaks to be attempting to suppress any talks of Novichok when she was Secretary of State. I think this was back in 2009. This is from WikiLeaks. So anyway, Trump wins the presidency before the contents of the Steele dossier are made public. However, the contents of the dossier were widely known in the media around the time of the election, and by the FBI, because the 35-page series of memos which were produced between June and December 2016 were floating around in those areas. But they didn't come to the public eye until January the 10th, 2017, just prior to Trump being inaugurated as president, when BuzzFeed published the details online. There's a link to it below. Now, coincidentally, this is maybe just a coincidence again, the first thing the UK government did at the time, when all this came to light and BuzzFeed published their expose, was the media, the UK media, were given D notices by the government in an attempt to stop Christopher Steele being named in any major outlet as the author of the P dossier. Now, a D notice, also called a DSMA notice or DA notice, is an official request to news editors from the government to not publish or broadcast items on specific subjects for reasons of national security. The system is still in use in the United Kingdom. Now, it's been used plenty of times before, D notices, or a DSMA notice, or DA notice, whatever you want to call it. For instance, in 2004 and 2005, there were 3 D notices sent to newspapers advising against publications of countermeasures used against roadside ambushes used by the British forces in the Iraq War. Now that, yeah, okay, you don't want the countermeasures being public because then your enemy can countermeasure the countermeasure. That makes sense. And the press went along with it. But then in June 2013, a DA notice was issued asking the media to refrain from running further stories related to the US prison program and British involvement of it. Now, I don't agree with that at all. PRISM is the surveillance program, the code name for the surveillance program that the NSA use, which collects internet communications from various US internet companies such as Facebook, Google, Apple, Yahoo, that sort of thing, and GCHQ have access to it. So I don't agree that a D notice should have been used in this instance. But anyway, there was a D notice used on the media publishing Christopher Steele's name back in 2017. Now, as that document you just saw said, a notice was issued against British journalists to try and stop his name coming out, but the BBC, the Telegraph and the Guardian all declined to adhere to the D notice on this occasion and published his name regardless. I suspect this is probably because anybody with an internet connection at the time knew who Christopher Steele was. It was all over the news worldwide on the internet. So that happened, and then 11 months later, at the UK government's top chemical, biological and nuclear research centre at Porton Down, a former Motorola phone salesman, Gary Aikenhead, is given the job as its chief. Now, I only bring this up because of the timing, because it's about 9 weeks after his arrival at Porton Down and just before the Skripal incident happened, that the UK held its largest ever chemical warfare drills, which ran from the 12th of February and 4th of March. And they ran them in Salisbury. As the Royal Navy website itself states, the movements and the drills, it climaxes with a full-scale exercise involving government and industry scientists and more than 300 military personnel, including the RAF Regiment and the RM Band Service. Casualty treatment was a key part of the Salisbury Plain exercise. So these drills were going on just before Skripal was poisoned, just a few miles away. On the 4th of March, he was poisoned. The day these largest ever chemical drills the UK has ever seen were due to finish, just a few miles away from where it was happening. Maybe is that a coincidence? I don't know. I'll let you decide. So Sergei Skripal and his daughter are taken to hospital, and the first reports were that they were suffering from the effects of some sort of psychoactive drug. They were acting a bit loopy. And the media didn't quite know what to make of all this, and nobody really knew the truth at the time. And while the media were trying to scramble to find out what was happening, and out of the blue, the day after the poisoning took place, and while everybody is still up in the air and Sky News are doing their brilliant work, reporting that 21 people were affected by the outbreak, the UK government slapped a D notice on the media mentioning either Pablo Miller in any of their reporting or Orbis Business Intelligence, Christopher Steele's private company. That's the first thing the media do. So the first thing they did when details of the Steele dossier came out was to slap a D notice on Steele being mentioned. And the first thing they did when Skripal was poisoned was to slap a D notice on Pablo Miller being mentioned in any reporting, or Steele's company, Orbis Business Intelligence. What does that tell you? Why is that? Why did they do that? Why did they do that if it's not got anything to do with the case? Of course it has. So this was about the time when we start getting the first reports of Novichok being mentioned, or of a type developed by Russia. Nonetheless, the hospital spokesperson at the time in charge of Salisbury Hospital said allegations of a chemical nerve agent that were flying must be wrong, because they had never admitted anyone at that hospital who was suffering from exposure to nerve agents ever. And I think they said there was only 3 people that they had ever treated with any significant amount of poisoning. Nobody mentioned whether these 3 cases actually were the Skripals and the policeman. Now, that report didn't get much press at the time, as they were running wild in the media trying to explain how the Skripals were poisoned. First, it was the story was Yulia inadvertently smuggled the Novichok into the UK in a box of cereal. Then the press theorised that they were poisoned by a powder through the car ventilation system. And then finally it came out that they were poisoned via a liquid on the door handle at the Skripal's home. This makes no sense at all. None of this makes any sense, to be honest. Why liquid on a door handle? I mean, what a stupid plan is that? Liquid would run off a door handle. It was also drizzly that day, so the water would have diluted it. And there's no guarantee that a door handle would get touched by the Skripals anyway. I leave my door all the time without touching the door handle. If I'm in the house and I leave, I don't touch it. And there was many doors, and I think that was one of them where a key would open the door. So there's no guarantee that it's going to get touched. My feeling is you need to come up with at least something a little more plausible than that as a story. Because if this really was an assassination attempt, as the government wants us to believe, it was totally cocked up by possibly the most monumentally stupid assassins who ever walked the planet. So, but anyway, this theory, ridiculous as it may seem, didn't stop every politician being quoted unchallenged by the entire corporate establishment media outlet this side of the Atlantic as saying this much now abused phrase of a type developed in Russia.
It is now clear that Mr. Skripal and his daughter were poisoned with a military-grade nerve agent of a type developed by Russia. This is part of a group of nerve agents known as Novichok.
The BBC even threw in a much ridiculed documentary, at least it was by me, which pointed the finger at this scary factory in Russia as the place where the Novichok could have originated from.
500 miles east of Moscow, on the banks of the Volga River, lies the vast Shikhani complex. Here, the Soviet and later the Russian military developed and tested their chemical weaponry.
There was experimental factory for production of experimental quantities of chemical agents and the others.
UK government officials were all very careful in their wording. They're all very careful to say of a type developed by Russia, apart from 1 or 2 instances where officials were caught in a lie, chief among which being Boris Johnson, when the guy I mentioned previously, the Motorola salesman Gary Aikenhead from Portland Down, gave a testimony to Sky News which looked somewhat similar to the sort of video that you would see recorded in a hostage situation.
We, in terms of our role, were able to identify it as Novichok, to identify that it was a military-grade nerve agent. We have not verified the precise source, but we provided the scientific information to the government, who have then used a number of other sources to piece together the conclusions that they've come to.
But you have not been able to establish at Portland Down that this was made in Russia?
As I said, it's our job to provide, the scientific evidence that identifies what the particular nerve agent is. We identified that it was from this family and that it's a military-grade nerve agent, but it's not our job to then say where that actually was manufactured.
Nevertheless, his not coerced at all statement highlighted a blatant Boris Johnson lie, although Boris Johnson faced no consequences whatsoever for the lie. And he probably got away scot-free with this lie because while the UK officials and media outlets on this side of the Atlantic were careful with their wording, the United States media just dispensed with the veil of a type developed by Russia altogether and went for an entirely more direct approach.
The United States stands in absolute solidarity with Great Britain. The United States believes that Russia is responsible for the attack on 2 people in the United Kingdom using a military-grade nerve agent. Russia's crime is worthy of this Council's action, but this is not an isolated incident. The assassination attempt in Salisbury is part of an alarming increase in the use of chemical weapons. Russia must fully cooperate with the UK's investigation and come clean about its own chemical weapons program. Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council. It is entrusted in the United Nations Charter with upholding international peace and security. It must account for its actions. This is a defining moment. Time and time again, member states say they oppose the use of chemical weapons under any circumstance. Now one member stands accused of using chemical weapons on the sovereign soil of another member. The credibility of this council will not survive if we fail to hold Russia accountable.
So anybody by this stage who called for a more measured approach and an investigation into the facts of what happened before any accusations or reactions were made were immediately attacked by the ever-obedient media as being Putin puppets or Kremlin stooges. And 150 Russian embassy staff were then expelled throughout the world, cementing the new Cold War we now live in place for the unforeseeable future. Russia, at this point in time in the story, have been accused of using chemical weapons on European soil for the first time since World War I. Now, if they didn't do anything here and they are innocent of anything that's happened, and if they had no knowledge of these matters as they claim that they have no knowledge of, they'd probably be mighty pissed off at this point at the West. But it's about to get much worse for them because a few weeks after all this happened, one of Putin's closest allies, Bashar al-Assad of Syria, gets accused of using chemical weapons as well. But this time on home soil against his own civilians when he's basically won the war. And the only possible explanation for him using them on his own people in this way would be that he, much like Skripal's would-be assassin, is also monumentally stupid.
Well, I think before you talk about sanctions, we ought to talk about, what evidence is there that that Russia was complicit in this attack. In fact, for that matter, I still look at the attack and say, Assad either must be the dumbest dictator on the planet or maybe he didn't do it. I have yet to see evidence that he did do it. The intelligence agencies claim they have that evidence. But think about it. Does it make any sense? He's been winning the war for the last couple of years. The only thing that would galvanize the world to attack Assad directly is a chemical attack. It killed relatively few people compared to what can be killed with traditional bombs, traditional machine guns, traditional tanks. And so you wonder, really, what logic would there be for Assad to be using chemical weapons? So before we get to the Russians, we have to first determine that Syria was implicated. And then really we ought to determine what the connection is between Russia and Syria on this attack.
As you know, not just the U.S., but France and the U.K., they participated in the bombing of these chemical sites in Syria. Are you saying, Senator, the president had bad intelligence?
I don't know. I haven't seen the intelligence. We have a briefing this afternoon where I may see some of this. But the difficulty is these things are not a slam dunk. This was Back in 2013, President Obama looked at that chemical attack, and at that point in time, there were his generals saying, hey, it's not a slam dunk, because you can detect that there were Syrian planes, you can detect that Syrians dropped bombs, but it's sometimes difficult to know whether they bombed an existing depot of weapons, and the rebels have been known to use chemical weapons, or whether the Syrians did it. If the Syrians did it, it gets back to the question, Assad must be the dumbest dictator on the planet to use chemical weapons when he knows from previous evidence it's the only thing that gets the world galvanized to attack him.
In both cases, there was a rush to judgment on the government's part to explain what happened and who was to blame, and not one single piece of valid evidence given that either had happened at all, let alone who was responsible. The latest revelation with the Skripal case, which was yesterday, would have been the 8th of May, is the green light has now been given to all allegedly affected areas in Salisbury except the Skripal's home. So now we can only assume that this means the official story is the last line that the government gave us, that the Skripals were poisoned at home by a liquid on the door handle. And that story doesn't look like it's going to change, which means the official story we have as to what happened with Julia and Sergei Skripal is they were supposedly poisoned at home with a military-grade 4th-generation nerve agent of a type developed in Russia called Novichok, which is 5 to 8 times more lethal than VX and should have killed them both in minutes. However, because the attempted murder was committed by the most monumentally stupid assassin ever to walk the planet, they managed to instead be infected, drive to the supermarket, walk to the pub for a drink, then walk to the restaurant and had a meal, before finally collapsing in a park hours after contact with this poison. We are also told that by way of sheer luck and sheer coincidence, the first to this scene is a police officer. What a coincidence that is. That's so close. So lucky he was so close. However, bad news for the police officer was he somehow was the only other person to feel a bit poorly that day. Now, all 3 people who were allegedly exposed to this Novichok, which is 5 to 8 times more lethal than VX and would kill you in minutes, all go on to make a miraculous recovery a few weeks later. All 3 have disappeared from the public view and have not been heard from since. And that's the official story we are supposed to believe. Not only is this what the government is saying, but the corporate and establishment media have all gone along with it too and not questioned it at all. It's bonkers, is what it is. If you're thinking this is bonkers, you're right. It's bonkers. It's bonkers that the government and the media expect an intelligent, independent thinking person to believe what they are telling us is true. As for what really happened, maybe one day the truth will come out. Maybe one day we'll have another Chilcot report moment, and maybe we'll find out exactly what happened and what lies have been told. And if you ask the average person on the street about either the Skripal case or Syria, an explanation that you hear a lot of, it smells a lot like Iraq again. And maybe the reason this whole affair seems to smell a lot like Iraq again to people is that just like with Iraq, we know we are being lied to. It's just a case of getting to the bottom of it. Now, as for whether Gibbs was right, as for whether there's no such thing as a coincidence, I can tell you that only a man with little knowledge of large mathematical equations would think that to be true. Because coincidences do happen sometimes. For instance, when I looked up the episode number where Gibbs' rule stating there is no such thing as confidence was first shown, I found the episode of NCIS where it was first revealed to be one of these rules was episode 21 of season 7, which coincidentally was an episode about the poisoning of a Russian spy and a female member of his family with ricin pellets. I guess you could say they were poisoned with a toxin of a type developed by the Soviet Union. But that is a coincidence. Coincidences can be seen everywhere if you look hard enough for them. But I am damn sure that if Leroy Jethro Gibbs was investigating this case, his team would be all over Pablo Miller, Christopher Steele, and Orbis Business Intelligence, like white on rice. It's where you start. As Craig Murray said brilliantly in an article, start looking where they tell you not to look. That's where you'll find the truth. Thanks very much to Craig, by the way. He's done some great work on this, as has Moon of Alabama. The links to the websites are down there. And that's basically all I've got on the Skripal affair. Whether we will find out what has happened, your guess is as good as mine. But it's been fun picking apart their lies for a time anyway. Hopefully it will continue. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and click the bell to be notified of any further videos that I publish. If you appreciate my work, please support the channel by sharing my videos or consider buying me a cup of coffee each month through recurring donations on Patreon or via one-off PayPal payments. The links are below. I can't do this without you. I'm fully funded by the audience, so thanks very much if you can support me to the tune of a few bucks a month. You can also find my work on Steemit and at my website gordondimmock.com. Again, links are below. Thanks very much for watching. Until next time, peace and take care.